As we launch into the book of Numbers, this is lesson 5 in our Logos Bible study. It's called Numbers, and so you assume that it's full of lots of numbers, and it does have numbers in it. It contains actually 2 census reports on the children of Israel, once at the beginning and once again toward the end. But the book of Numbers was originally titled with the Hebrew phrase that means numbers in the wilderness. And as the Old Testament was translated into Greek in a book called the Septuagint, its name became arithmai, which sounds a lot like arithmetic. And then when the Septuagint was translated into Latin in the Vulgate, it became known as numeri. And then, of course, when it came into our English translation, it was simply called Numbers. It's called Numbers, obviously, because it contains the 2 census reports on the children of Israel. Numbers takes up where Exodus left off. There's about a month between the end of Exodus and the beginning of Numbers. Now, I know Leviticus is stuck in there between the 2 of them, but the instructions that are given in the book of Leviticus were given during that month between Exodus and Numbers. And it says in Exodus 40, verse 17, so the tabernacle was set up on the first day of the first month in the second year. And then we read in Numbers 1:1, the Lord spoke to Moses in the tent of meeting, that's the tabernacle, in the desert of Sinai on the first day of the second month of the second year, after the Israelites came out of Egypt. And so we have the first month, and then we have the second month. That's how we know pretty accurately that there was a month between the end of Exodus and the beginning of Numbers. The New Testament refers to Numbers on at least 2 occasions. I'm not going to go into a lot of that tonight. You can read those passages in your study notes, but they're 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and also Hebrews 3, 7 through 19. And that helps us to tie the scriptures together. There are a lot of references in the New Testament back to the Old Testament, and it ties everything together. And remember, that's part of our purpose with these rapid fire book studies on Wednesday nights, to find the thread that runs from Genesis all the way through to the book of Revelation. And so that thread is obvious in the book of Numbers, as the New Testament refers back to Numbers on many occasions. Now, the book of Numbers is a book of movement. It chronicles the movement of the children of Israel through the wilderness, and the movement from one generation, the generation that came out of Egypt, and the next generation. And so there are 2 generations, 2 numberings or census, and 2 sets of instructions. And we'll get to those in just a moment. We are going to move from the old generation to the new generation in the book of Numbers, and we're going to see why that was necessary. In chapters 1 through 14, we see the older generation, the first generation of the nation of Israel. These are the folks that came out of Egypt, former slaves, traveling from Sinai to Kadesh. And the numbering of adult males takes place in chapter 1. And we find that there are roughly 600,000 males. Now, this was done for military purposes, but that gives us a pretty accurate understanding that by this time, the nation of Israel numbers somewhere around 1.5 or even 1.6 million people. And they're traveling through the desert. And so in chapter 1, a census is taken and we see the number of adult males, and you can extrapolate that out to include females and children in the total. In chapter 2, we see the distribution of the tribes, and in chapter 3, the Levites are numbered separately. That's because the Levites are the priestly tribe. They make up the priesthood, and they were exempt from the general census because as priests, they were set apart to serve God and care for the tabernacle. And in chapter 4, you see the duties of the Levites, and they are numerous, and we'll get into a little bit of that later on tonight. Then in chapters 5 through 10, there are instructions, and these deal with the inward arrangements of the camp and the rules that they are to follow, because, again, you've got 1.5 million people roughly, and they're living out in the desert, and they're traveling, and they're trying to survive and move forward. And so it was necessary for a structure to be put in place. And much of that was done in the book of Leviticus, but Numbers continues that. And chapter 5 deals with purity and honesty and truth. And then in chapter 6, we see a special vow established. Now, understand, this is called the Nazirite vow, and it has nothing to do with Nazarene. Do not get the two words confused. Nazirite is basically an Old Testament Hebrew word. Nazarene is a designation that was given to someone from the city of Nazareth in Jesus' day. Don't get them mixed up. And they don't have anything to do with the Nazarene denomination, the churches, all of that. The Nazirite is a completely separate thing. They just happen to sound alike. It was a special vow, voluntary, something that a person would choose to do, dedicate themselves more deeply to the Lord. And you see it laid out there. They had to abstain from wine and other fermented drink, including vinegar, and they could not drink grape juice. They couldn't eat grapes or raisins. They had to stay away from everything having to do with the grapevine, even the seeds and the skins. And no razor could be used on their head. They couldn't cut their hair. It was to grow long as an outward testimony of the vow they had taken. They must never go near a dead body. And even if their mother or their father or a family member died, they were not allowed to participate in any of the arrangements or to be anywhere near that dead body. In fact, if someone died suddenly in the presence of a Nazirite, they had to shave their head and then make a special sin offering and a burnt offering and consecrate their head again. And the previous days do not count, it says in chapter 6, verse 12, which means they had to start over. You see, when you took a Nazirite vow, you went before the Lord, you made the sacrifices, and you said, I am going to keep this vow for this period of time. And when the period of time was over, then the Nazirite was brought to the tent of meeting, to the tabernacle, and they would present the appropriate offerings to the Lord, and they are laid out in verses 13 through 20. And after that time, the Nazirite vow was laid aside, unless, of course, such as was the case with a guy you may have heard of, Samson. The Nazirite vow was a lifelong vow. And when we get to the book of Judges, we will see that Samson broke it right and left regularly all the time, and that ultimately led to his demise. And so that's the Nazirite vow. And then in chapter 7, the leaders of each tribe of the nation of Israel brought free will offerings for the work of the tabernacle, not the construction. It was already built. And it was being used and moved from place to place, and all of that was working fine. But this was for the maintenance and the work that needed to be done in order for worship to take place in the tabernacle. Chapter 8 involves the consecration of the Levites. And then in chapter 9, we see this first generation and their children observing the Passover. And what an interesting thing that must have been, because here they are, they're out of Egypt, they've been out now, and they're going to observe the Passover, which commemorated that night in Egypt when they were spared by the death angel because they had put the blood of the lamb on the doorposts of their homes. And God laid out some instructions, some additional instructions that he had not given in the book of Leviticus, and they were to observe the Passover. Now, I want you to read with me, if you've got it in front of you, beginning with verse 15. This is following their observance of the Passover. We're going to read this whole passage 15 through 23 because I want you to pick up on how the Israelites were making their way through the wilderness. On the day the tabernacle, the tent of the covenant law, was set up, the cloud covered it. Remember, the cloud is the presence of God. From evening till morning, the cloud above the tabernacle looked like fire. This is how it continued to be. The cloud covered it, and at night it looked like fire. Whenever the cloud lifted from above the tent, the Israelites set out. Wherever the cloud settled, the Israelites encamped. At the Lord's command, the Israelites set out, and at his command, they encamped. As long as the cloud stayed over the tabernacle, they remained in camp. When the cloud remained over the tabernacle a long time, the Israelites obeyed the Lord's order and did not set out. Sometimes the cloud was over the tabernacle only a few days. At the Lord's command, they would encamp, and then at his command, they would set out. Sometimes the cloud stayed only from evening till morning, and when it lifted in the morning, they set out, whether by day or by night. Whenever the cloud lifted, they set out. Whether the cloud stayed over the tabernacle for 2 days or a month or a year, the Israelites would remain in camp and not set out. At the Lord's command, they encamped, and at the Lord's command, they set out. They obeyed the Lord's order in accordance with his command through Moses. Doesn't that sound fantastic? Here they are. They have the cloud, and during the day, it just looked like a cloud, and it settled there over the tabernacle. And at night, it looked like fire, which, of course, was so they could see it. And whenever that cloud would lift from the tabernacle, they'd pack it in, and they'd follow the cloud wherever it led them. And that sounds wonderful, and I'm sure it was wonderful. What assurance would come from having that cloud right there, this tangible sign of God's direction. At times here in the modern age, we wish he'd come and be a cloud, and so we could just follow him like that. But what if you were a Levite? Did any of you read the requirements for the Levites regarding the tabernacle as they were laid out in Exodus and Leviticus and some here in Numbers? Only the Levites could handle the tabernacle. Only the Levites could pack that monstrous, beautiful tent and all of the ornate furnishings and all the worship utensils and everything that went into it. Only the Levites could do that, and they did it in addition to packing up their own things. And if you read this carefully, you see sometimes that cloud would settle and they'd stay for a few days or a week or maybe even a month or more. But sometimes it would settle, and then a few hours later, it'd take off again. How would you like to be that Levite? Because they were required to set that tabernacle up every time they stopped. And I see the humor in it, because here's this Levite. He's just driving the last peg of the last corner of the last bit of that huge tent structure, and the cloud moves. And I wonder if they got frustrated with it, perhaps. And there's a lesson there for us to learn, especially those of you who do the work of the church. You do a great deal. You're showing up and doing things and volunteering and taking care of stuff. And at times, I know, because we're all human, you get to thinking you're the only one doing it, or maybe you're doing more than anyone else, and maybe you are. Always remember who we do it for, and don't get discouraged in it. And let's just be like the Levites and the children of Israel. When God moves, we move. When he gives us a direction, we follow it. And sometimes that means some of us are going to have to work a little harder, but that's okay. We get to serve the Lord in all that. Yeah, thank you for that, Mary. Yeah, it requires persistence. You're right about that. All right, in chapter 10, God instructed Moses to have 2 trumpets made, and these were to help the children of Israel follow. Now, obviously, they've got the cloud, but you've got 1.5 million people, and I can't even imagine the massive amount of land they would occupy all at one time. And then it was time to move, or then it was time to stop, and the trumpets helped. And then there, near the end of chapter 10, they set out and they leave Sinai. And then in chapter 11, the grumbling starts. Verses 1 through 3 record how the people began to complain about their hardships. And God heard it. And when he did, he was angry. Of course he was angry. Look at all he has done for these people already. And then fire from the Lord burned them and consumed some of the outskirts of the camp. And when the people cried out to Moses, he prayed to the Lord, and the fire died down, so that the place was called Taberah, because fire from the Lord had burned among them. There is a very special relationship between God and Moses all throughout the 5 books of the Pentateuch. It is a relationship that is, I believe, unique in all of Scripture. Now, Moses is not divine. He's not Jesus. He doesn't, nowhere near that. We're not saying that. But among those of us who are human, Moses had this beautiful, unique relationship with God, so that when he prayed, it seems like God really listened. Now, he really listens to you and I, but Moses and God had this very special thing going, where this is not the only time that we will find Moses going before the Lord and asking him to give the people a break. How much Moses must have loved these people. And at that point, God gave them quail. He caused quail to simply come along and drop from the sky so that they had meat to eat. And that seemed to soothe things for a while. But then in chapter 12, there's a little bit of a mini revolt. Miriam, his own sister, and Aaron began to talk about Moses, it says, because of his Cushite wife. Moses had married a woman and they didn't approve of her. especially Miriam, it seems. And they said, has the Lord spoken only through Moses? Hasn't he also spoken through us? Now, here's the problem. When we speak against one another, God hears. And it says in verse 2 of chapter 12, the Lord heard them. He heard what they were saying. And he took them aside. He took them to the woodshed, so to speak. In verse 6, he said, listen to my words. When there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, reveal myself to them in visions. I speak to them in dreams. But this is not true of my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. With him I speak face to face and clearly, and not in riddles. He sees the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? Now, there used to be this thing years and years ago where people would say, now, don't touch the Lord's anointed. It was a lot of times it was preachers quoting that verse when people were mad at us for whatever we'd done. And I get that. There is a certain amount of respect that goes along with bringing the word of God to the church, and Scripture holds that out. However, I think this concept goes even farther. You and I as believers must be very careful anytime we speak against another believer, because God hears it. And in Miriam's case, she was struck with leprosy. It ticked God off that she spoke against Moses, that she grumbled to other people about him. It made God angry, and he brought the punishment. And Moses had to pray for her healing. But even though he prayed for her healing, God said she's going to have to stay outside the camp for 7 days until she is cleansed. And I wanted to learn her lesson. And so that was the end of that little mini rebellion. Then in chapters 12 through 14, the Israelites have arrived. They're on the bank of the Jordan River opposite the Promised Land. They're ready. And Moses sent 12 men, one from each tribe, to explore Canaan. You may be familiar with this story. And among those were two men called Caleb and Joshua. Remember those two. And when they came back, it says in verse 26 of chapter 13, they came back to Moses and Aaron and the whole Israelite community at Kadesh. There they reported to them and showed them the fruit of the land. We went to the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here is its fruit. But the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. Then Caleb silenced the people before Moses and said, we should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it. But the men who had gone up with him said, we can't attack those people. They are stronger than we are. The land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw were of great size. We saw the Nephilim there. We seemed like grasshoppers in our eyes, and we looked like the same to them. Now there's that word Nephilim. We ran across that when we studied the book of Genesis. Genesis 6:4 says the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward. And when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them, they were the heroes of old, men of renown. Now, I did some digging because, Michael, you asked this several weeks ago. Who are the Nephilim? Here's what we can figure out and understand. This is it's an opinion, okay? They were probably powerful rulers, not Israelites. They didn't have Israelites in Genesis. They were probably powerful rulers who were controlled or indwelt by fallen angels, which we refer to as demons. They were strong and they were powerful. They were referred to as sons of God, but that's probably a title they gave themselves. You know, many of the cultures around this time believed that those who ruled them were gods, and they worshiped them as such, because to tick off the king was to put your life at risk. And so if the king says he's God, fine, he's God. That's the way they looked at it. They were not divine, but they were, we believe, demon controlled. They were powerful and they were influenced by the demonic, but they were mortal. Their children were apparently giants by the standards of that day. However, they were flesh and blood, and in due course, they died out. But apparently, they were still around in the days of the book of Numbers. And so the people begin to grumble, it says there in chapter 14, and they raised their voices and they wept aloud. And listen to what they said. If only we had died in Egypt or in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to, listen, go back to Egypt? And they were going to choose another leader and go back to Egypt, back to slavery. And God was ready to destroy all of them. This is the second or third time that he's been ready just to wipe them all out and start over with Moses and his descendants. But again, Moses pleaded for them. You're going to see that time and time again throughout the Pentateuch. Moses loved these people, and time and again, he went back to God and pleaded for them. Now, it says in Numbers 14, verse 29, the Lord replied to Moses, I have forgiven them as you ask. Nevertheless, as surely as I live and as surely as the glory of the Lord fills the whole earth, not one of those who saw my glory and the signs I performed in Egypt and in the wilderness, not one of them will ever see the land I promised on oath to their ancestors. In this wilderness, your bodies will fall. Every one of you 20 years old or more who was counted in the census, remember the census at the beginning of the book, and who has grumbled against me, not one of you will enter the land I swore with uplifted hand to make your home, except Caleb, son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, son of Nun, because those two men said, with God as our strength, we can do this. And then the Lord went on. These men who were responsible for spreading the bad report about the land were struck down and died of a plague before the Lord. Of the men who went to explore the land, only Joshua and Caleb survived. Now, this is why the nation of Israel spends 40 years wandering in the wilderness, and the people were upset. They knew what they'd done. In fact, the next morning it says in verses 40 and 45, they went back and they started packing up and heading into the promised land. They said, we're ready to go now. And Moses told them, no, this won't work. You can't do it. God says no. And the Amalekites and the Canaanites who lived in the land came down and just beat the snot out of them, because God had now decided this generation would not get the promised land because they had refused to go in when the opportunity was right there before them, and they knew it was what God wanted. That brings us into the second section of the book of Numbers, the wandering era. They're going to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. They could have gone from Egypt to Canaan in a matter of weeks. But now they're going to meander and wander for 40 years, waiting to die, because they had failed to seize the opportunity that God put before them. In chapter 15, however, God expressed hope for the coming generation by giving additional instructions regarding offerings and keeping the Sabbath and wearing tassels on their garments, which seems silly, but if God had given up on them, he would not have given them all that. So this generation is not going to get the promised land, but their descendants would. Then there was another rebellion in chapter 16 as Korah and certain Reubenites, they became insolent, and they got 250 other Israelite men who were well-known community leaders and, men of some importance. And they came and said to Moses and Aaron, "You've gone too far. This whole community is holy, every one of them, and the Lord is with them. Why then do you set yourselves above the Lord's assembly?" Now, Moses knew what was going to happen, and he loved the people so much, he went face down before Korah and all these people and basically said, "Don't do this. Don't do this thing." And they pressed on, and eventually they were consumed by the ground, which split apart and swallowed, and fire came down from the Lord and consumed all of them. Then in chapter 17, Aaron's staff blossomed because God had to establish for the people that Aaron was the one he had chosen to be the high priest. And this staff was placed in the tabernacle in front of the Ark of the Covenant. And this was done permanently, even on into the early days of the temple. And in chapter 18, there are additional instructions for the priesthood and for Levites. In chapter 19, there's cleansing water. And then in chapter 20, we start to see some of the tragedy of the generation passing away. Miriam died, and she was buried at Kadesh. And Eleazar was chosen to succeed Aaron, and he died. And then Moses disobeyed. God had told him, and I know this seems trivial, but it was important for what God was trying to do. He was trying to build a people based on their faith in him. And if the leader of those people cannot exhibit that faith, then there's going to have to be a new leader, even though it was Moses. Moses disobeyed God because he was told to speak to the rock and water would come forth. He spoke to the rock and the water didn't come out quick enough to suit him. He became impatient and he struck the rock with his staff. There are those that believe he became impatient. There are those that believe he was kind of showing off. And he wanted the Israelites to see that staff smacking that rock and then water gushing out. But God told him in verse 12 of chapter 20, "Because you did not trust enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them." And then we come to the new generation, verses 21 through 36. Now, if you think we've been moving fast already, hang on, we're going to go a little faster because I want to get this finished, and we've got about 15 minutes left. In chapter 21, the king of Arad attacked the Israelites and was destroyed. Always be careful when messing with God's chosen people. And even in the church, because we are the church of Christ, we are afforded certain protections. So we don't need to be afraid when people criticize or when they come against the church, that we're the church of Christ. He is our head, and he will see to our well-being. And then the Israelites spoke against God. There's more mumbling and grumbling. And when they did, God sent snakes this time, venomous snakes, and it killed some of them. But then as the people repented and cried out in agony, because it hurts to get bitten by a snake, apparently, under God's instruction, Moses made this bronze snake, and he put it on the end of a pole that was way up in the air, so that anytime someone got bitten by a snake, they could look at the pole and they would not die. Now, it does not say they would not suffer. I suspect they got really sick, and they suffered, and they struggled, but they looked at that snake, and they did not die. And during this time, the Israelites traveled from Kadesh to Moab, and along the way they defeated Sihon and Og. Those are two nations that were along the way. Then in chapters 22 through 24, we come across this guy named Balaam. Now, make no mistake, Balaam was not a prophet of God. He was a seer. He was part of a cult of diviners and seers who consulted spirits and were known to give blessings and curses. They were a cult of superstition, basically. And the king of Moab, when he sees the Israelites coming, I mean, you can see him for miles, right? He knows they're coming, and he knows their power, and he has a sense that somebody is on their side. And the king's name was Balak. Keep those two names straight. Balak is the king. Balaam is this seer, this shaman, or whatever you want to call him. And he called for Balaam. He wanted Balaam to give him a spell or something, or put a curse on those Israelites. And God said to Balaam in verse 12 of chapter 22, do not go with them. You must not put a curse on these people because they are blessed. And so Balaam told the king's messengers what he had heard and that he could not go with them. And then the king comes in with, a couple truckloads of gold and all the wealth and stuff. And Balaam says, that makes no difference. These people are favored. They are blessed. I can't do this. But that night, God came to Balaam and said, since these men have come to summon you, go with them, but do only what I tell you. Now then, along the way, Balaam's riding his donkey, and the angel of the Lord stops, big and bold, right in front of him on the road. Now remember, Balaam's not a prophet of God, so this angel is there, and he's ready to strike Balaam down. Why? Because he was being stupid. He should not have entered into this relationship with Balak the king anyway. Should have just said no and stuck to it. But, God said, okay, fine, since these guys are here, you go on ahead, but you be careful what you say. Only say what I tell you. Well, the angel is there, and he's going to strike Balaam down. He's going to put a stop to this. And the donkey sees the angel, but Balaam doesn't. And they go through this whole exchange where at one point he gets off and he just starts smacking the donkey around. And the donkey speaks to him and says, hey, wait a minute. Am I not your donkey? Have I ever caused you any problem before? And Balaam says, well, no. And at that point, he sees the angel and he knows the donkey has pretty much saved his life. Well, then, over the course of time and through a series of 7 messages that he got from God, Balaam, in roundabout ways, blessed the Israelites while advising Balak, the king of Moab. Well, this didn't work out well for the king of Moab, and so in chapter 25, we have what's called the Moabite seduction. Because the king could not overcome the Israelites in conventional military ways, they just let the two cultures kind of come together. And some of the men of Israel, remember, when you have this many, you're bound to have some stinkers in the group. And some of the men of Israel began to have relationships with these women of Moabite, and because of Moab, I should say, and because of that, they began to worship the Moabite idols. We can't seem to get away from that stuff. And so we have another issue that God has to deal with. And then in chapter 26, the second census is taken. And in chapter 27, Joshua is chosen to succeed Moses. Now, we're not going to cover that a great deal now. We'll get to that when we get to the book of Joshua here in a couple of weeks. Chapters 28 through 30 contain additional instructions. In chapter 31, we see Midian conquered. In chapter 32, the tribes of Reuben and Gad and half of Manasseh were allotted land on the opposite side of the Jordan River from the Promised Land. the condition of that was that in order to be given that allotment that they were asking for, Moses told them they had to go in and help the rest of Israel, the other tribes, conquer their land. Then they could go back and have this allotment that they were requesting, and they agreed to those terms. Then in chapter 33, Moses kind of goes back and gives a full account. This is his logbook of the trip from Egypt to Canaan. And if you have a good Old Testament map, you can trace that. You may even have this in some of your Bibles, and it'll show the journey through the wilderness. In chapter 25, we have towns set aside for the Levites because they were not given an allotment of land. They needed someplace to live, so they were given towns within each of the tribes. And we also have a concept introduced called cities of refuge. These were places where people who were being chased or victimized or accused of a crime, or maybe had even committed a crime, could go and figure stuff out and get justice or eventually be punished, or they could go there instead of being taken away by the mob. And then in we close the book with an interesting section: instructions for daughters who inherit land. This would become a problem over the generations, because if a father had a daughter who was not married at the time the father died, then his land passed to her. If he had no sons, it would go to the daughter. And then the daughter would get married, and because of the laws of the day, that land would go to her husband. And if that happened enough times, these nice, even allotments between the 12 tribes would get all screwed up. And so they put a system in place so that the land that went with the daughter would revert back to its original allotment. They were doing the best they could to make sure that things stayed the way they needed to stay. I understand now why I was having so much trouble with the chapters here just now. I said chapter 25 was the towns for the Levites and cities of refuge. You were too polite to point it out, but that's chapter 35. I put a 2 there instead of a 3, and we closed the book with chapter 36. Now, I wanted to say just a word about the 12 tribes of Israel. Somebody asked me about this a few days ago. Originally, and this is in your notes, originally the 12 tribes were Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. Those were the 12 sons of Israel. And those are what became these 12 tribes. However, by the time we're entering Canaan, or getting, wandering in the wilderness and getting ready for Canaan, the 12 tribes have evolved slightly, because Jewish tradition is such that Joseph was never really a tribe. And so he's taken out of the mix. And the Levites were not counted among the 12 because they were not given an allotment of land in Canaan. So the 12 tribes then become Reuben, Simeon, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin. And Levi and Joseph are replaced by Ephraim and Manasseh, the 2 sons of Joseph. And so those would be the more proper 12 tribes as the nation of Israel is wandering in the wilderness and as they get ready to move into the promised land. We will take up with the book of Deuteronomy next week. Thank you for staying with this. I know, again, I keep using the analogy. It's a drinking from a fire hose, but stay with it. Keep reading for yourself and use those study guides to guide you through. And if you have any questions, send them over. If I can, I'll answer them in here. But if not, I'll send it out to everybody. And appreciate your time. I love you guys. I hope to see all of you on Sunday. Good night.